In the grand theater of world literature, few adventures shine as brilliantly as those we bring to life. Here on Echoes of Stories. Tonight, the darkness parts to reveal a legend, the Count of Monte Cristo, by the master storyteller Alexandre Dumas. First unveiled in serial form in 1844, this immortal tale has enthralled generations, a saga of betrayal, vengeance, and the quest for redemption. The version you are about to hear is drawn from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, preserved in its purest form for all who seek its power. And now, the next chapter awaits. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 11. Franz had carefully planned their route to the Colosseum. During the ride, they did not pass a single ancient ruin. Nothing interrupted the first overwhelming impression of the gigantic monument they were about to admire. The road they chose continued from the Via Sistina, by cutting across the angle near Santa Maria Maggiore, then moving through Via Urbana and San Pietro and Vincoli. The travelers arrived directly in front of the Colosseum. This path carried another advantage. It allowed Franz to indulge in quiet reflection about Signor Pastrini's story, in which the mysterious host from Monte Cristo played a strange part. Seated in the corner of the carriage, with his arms folded, Franz remained deep in thought. He pondered over the tale he had heard, asking himself countless questions about its details. Yet no answer satisfied him. One particular fact recalled his friend, known as Sinbad the Sailor. It was the curious link between sailors and brigands. Pastrini had spoken of Vampa finding refuge on smugglers' vessels. This reminded Franz of the Corsican bandits he once saw dining peacefully with sailors on a yacht. That yacht had even changed its course just to land them at Porto Vecchio. The name Monte Cristo, repeated both by his mysterious host and the innkeeper of the Hotel de Londres, confirmed his suspicions. It suggested that the man he knew had acted as a benefactor not only around Corsica, Tuscany, and Spain, but also along the shores of Piombino, Civita Vecchia, Ostia, and Gaeta. Franz also remembered how the same man had spoken of Tunis and Palermo, which revealed the wide range of his connections. But these reflections quickly faded. Before Franz's eyes rose the dark ruins of the Colosseum. The pale moonlight flickered through its arches like ghostly eyes watching from a land of the dead. Their carriage stopped near the Medici dance. As the door opened, the young men stepped out and were immediately met by a guide who appeared so suddenly. It seemed as if he had sprung from the earth. Another guide from the hotel followed them. They had, in fact, paid 2 men. In Rome, such abundance of guides was unavoidable. Each monument had its own attendant, sometimes even each part of a monument. So, as expected, there was no shortage at the Colosseum. Martial had once written of this wonder, saying that the pyramids of Memphis and the marvels of Babylon paled in comparison to the mighty labor of the Caesars, whose work demanded the admiration of all time. Albert and Franz made no attempt to resist these cicerones. It would have been useless, for only guides were permitted to enter the ruins with torches. So they surrendered to their conductors. Franz had already visited the Colosseum many times, but for Albert this was his first encounter. His mind, even through the chatter of the guides, was deeply touched with awe and admiration. Truly, no description could capture the grandeur of those ruins, especially beneath the light of the southern moon. The vast structure appeared twice as large, bathed in silver radiance equal to the twilight of a western sky. As Franz walked beneath the arches, he soon left Albert to the guides, who dragged their visitors through the same routine every time. They showed the Lion's Den, the Hall of the Gladiators, and ended at Caesar's Podium. Wishing to avoid this mechanical tour, Franz slipped away up a broken staircase. He seated himself at the base of a column opposite a wide opening, from where he could enjoy a calm and solitary view of the immense ruins. For nearly 15 minutes, he remained hidden in the shadow. His eyes followed Albert and the guides, who, with torches in hand, moved like ghostly figures across the opposite end of the Colosseum. Their light resembled wandering flames as they descended toward the seats once reserved for the Vestal Virgins. Suddenly, Franz heard the sound of stone falling from a staircase across from him. At first, it seemed natural, like a fragment breaking away. But then he sensed the weight of footsteps, cautious and deliberate, as if someone tried to remain unheard while approaching his spot. His suspicions soon proved correct. A man emerged slowly into view, revealed by the full moonlight. Perhaps this stranger, like Franz, sought solitude away from the chatter of guides. Yet his hesitation, the way he paused and listened with nervous attention, suggested he expected someone. By instinct, Franz pulled himself back behind a pillar. Near them, a great hole opened in the roof, framing the star-filled sky. Around its edges, climbing plants and thick vines dangled, swaying in the night air. The mysterious man stood in the half-light. His features could not be seen, but his clothing was clear. He wore a large brown cloak, one fold thrown over his shoulder, hiding the lower part of his face. A wide-brimmed hat covered the rest. The moonlight, streaming through the broken ceiling, revealed his polished leather boots and his black trousers cut in fashionable style. Franz had little to go on, yet he felt certain that the man he was observing belonged to no ordinary class. A few minutes passed, and the stranger's impatience became clear. Then a faint noise came from the opening above, and a shadow blocked the light. Another figure appeared, scanning the space below with sharp attention. As soon as his eyes caught the cloaked man, he grasped a mass of tangled branches, slid down with ease, and landed lightly on his feet. This bold act was carried out with a calm indifference, and the newcomer's clothing revealed him as a man from Trastevere. The two men began to speak. The one in the Roman dress apologized for the delay, explaining that he had just come from the castle of St. Angelo and had struggled to find a chance to speak with someone inside. Franz listened as he revealed that 2 executions were scheduled for the day after tomorrow, a grim custom at the start of great Roman festivals. One man, a murderer, would be struck down with the mallet. The other, a poor shepherd named Peppino, was to be beheaded. The cloaked figure pointed out that this was meant as a warning, not only to Rome but to the surrounding states. The man from Trastevere insisted Peppino was innocent of any real crime, yet guilty by association since he had supplied food to the band. The conversation turned tense. The cloaked man explained that while Peppino's sentence was harsh, at least he would die by the guillotine rather than by brutal blows. The man from Trastevere declared that he would risk everything to free him. His plan was simple but dangerous: surround the scaffold with his men and rescue Peppino at the signal. The cloaked man disagreed, believing money could accomplish more than blades. He described his own scheme: to use bribes to win a reprieve and then ensure Peppino's escape. He even laid out signals using draped colors of the Café Rossbali windows: white with a red cross for success, yellow for failure. As the discussion continued, loyalty and promises were exchanged. The man from Trastevere swore absolute devotion if Peppino was saved, while the cloaked man reminded him that one day he might ask for the same in return. Their secret meeting was suddenly interrupted by sounds of travelers exploring the Colosseum with torches. The cloaked man advised that they part, for guides could be spies. They agreed on their signals, and the Trasteveran disappeared. His companion then drew his cloak tightly around his face, walked past Franz, and descended toward the arena. Moments later, Albert's voice echoed through the ancient walls, calling for Franz. Franz delayed his response until he was sure the two men had gone. When he rejoined Albert, he appeared to listen to his friend's lecture on Roman defenses, yet his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the voices he had just heard. One of the men was unknown to him, but the other's voice struck him deeply. Though the cloak and shadows hid the features, the sound of that voice was unforgettable. It was the same commanding tone he had once heard in the grotto of Monte Cristo. The more he reflected, the more convinced he became that the cloaked man was none other than his former host, the mysterious Sinbad the sailor. Franz, under different circumstances, would never have resisted the temptation to learn more about such an unusual man. His curiosity would have driven him to renew the short acquaintance. Yet, given the confidential nature of the conversation he had overheard, he judged it wise to remain unseen. With deliberate restraint, he allowed his former host to leave without acknowledgement, all the while assuring himself that if fate offered another chance, he would seize it and satisfy his questions. Despite his efforts, Franz could not free his mind from troubling thoughts. He tried to summon sleep, but it refused to come. The night passed in restless reflection, his mind circling around the connection between the mysterious visitor at the Colosseum and the enigmatic inhabitant of Monte Cristo's grotto. The more he considered, the stronger his conviction became. Exhausted at last, he drifted into sleep at dawn and did not stir until late. By that time, Albert had spent the morning arranging the evening's entertainment. He secured a box at the Teatro Argentina, while Franz, burdened with letters to write, surrendered the carriage for Albert's use the entire day. When Albert returned at 5 o'clock, he was full of excitement. He had delivered his letters of introduction and received more invitations to gatherings and balls than he could ever attend. He had also hurried through all the remarkable sights of Rome, completing in a single day what Franz would have stretched over weeks. In addition, Albert learned that the opera Parisina would be performed that evening, featuring Coselli, Moriani, and La Specchia. The two friends considered themselves fortunate, for they would hear one of the best works of the composer of Lucia di Lammermoor, presented by three celebrated voices of Italy. Albert, however, never truly enjoyed Italian theaters. He disliked their orchestras, hidden from view, and the absence of balconies. Such flaws weighed heavily on someone accustomed to the comforts of Parisian theaters. Yet he still dressed in his finest attire whenever he went, determined to display his elegance. Unfortunately, his efforts were wasted, for throughout Italy he failed to attract the kind of adventures he had hoped for. Sometimes he laughed at his lack of success, but inwardly his pride suffered. He believed that Albert de Morcerf, admired by so many in Paris, should have inspired admiration everywhere. He had expected to return to Paris with dazzling tales of conquest, but instead, he gained only disappointment. The Italian women remained faithful, if not to their husbands, then at least to their chosen lovers. Even Albert's fashionable presence could not shake their devotion. Still, he clung to hope that exceptions existed. After all, he was not only attractive and intelligent, but also a viscount with a handsome income of 50,000 livres. By Parisian standards, this made him a person of significance, and so his failure to draw notice in Italy felt even more bitter. Nevertheless, he was determined that during the approaching carnival in Rome, he would find the recognition he craved. He secured a box in the most prominent part of the theater, dressed himself with elaborate care, and eagerly awaited the possibilities the festival might bring. That evening, Albert leaned forward in his seat, studying every beautiful face through his opera glass, hoping to capture attention. Yet no one noticed him. The women were preoccupied with themselves, their companions, or their own thoughts. The excitement of the carnival and the anticipation of Holy Week left little interest in the stage or its audience. Actors came and went almost unnoticed, and only at certain brilliant performances did the crowd stir, applaud, or listen with focus. Soon after, they returned to their distractions. As the first act drew to a close, a vacant box suddenly opened. A lady entered, one Franz had met in Paris and had thought still to be there. Albert instantly noticed Franz's surprise and followed his gaze. The newcomer was none other than the Countess G, a Venetian woman of striking beauty and intelligence. Franz had spoken with her a few times before, and though the connection was slight, it was enough for recognition. She noticed him as well, offering a graceful wave, which he acknowledged with respect. Albert, intrigued by Franz's composure, reflected on how easily Parisians misjudged the customs of Italy, often mistaking polite gestures for intimacy. To Franz, however, the bond was not of affection, but of shared taste and sentiment. They had met at the Colosseum under moonlight, not for romance, but for conversation about the great figures of history whose memory lingered in the ruins. Albert could hardly believe such restraint. To him, a moonlit walk with a woman of such beauty should have inspired conversations about life and passion, not death and memory. Yet Franz remained calm, convinced that their connection was one of mutual respect for art and history, nothing more. Franz remained calm, quietly noting that Albert would likely find his chosen theme poorly suited. Yet Albert, impatient as ever, brushed aside all mention of the past. His focus was fixed only on the present, pressing Franz to fulfill his promise of an introduction to the beautiful woman they had been discussing. Franz assured him that the meeting would happen as soon as the curtain fell. Albert grew restless, complaining about the length of the first act and doubting it would ever end. Franz, more attentive, urged him to listen to the finale, praising the delicate skill of Coselli. Albert dismissed the singer, remarking on his lack of grace and refinement. Franz pointed out the remarkable talent of La Specchia. Yet Albert, comparing her with celebrated stars of Paris, found her lacking. Even Morigny, whose style and technique drew admiration, failed to impress him. Albert could not reconcile the man's heavy, imposing figure with his unexpectedly delicate voice. Franz, amused, turned to him with patience, observing that Albert seemed determined to disapprove of everything. At last, the curtain dropped, much to Albert's relief. With great energy, he seized his hat, smoothed his hair, straightened his cravat, and adjusted his wristbands. Then he signaled to Franz that he was ready. Franz, having already exchanged a subtle glance with the Countess and received a gracious smile of welcome, did not delay. He rose at once to escort Albert, who took the few moments of their walk across the theater to perfect the height of his collar and the folds of his coat. When they arrived at the Countess's box, Franz knocked softly. The door opened immediately. A young man, seated beside the Countess in accordance with Italian custom, stood at once and politely yielded his place to the newcomers. By the same courtesy, it was understood that Franz and Albert would eventually when other visitors appeared. Franz introduced Albert with the highest praise, describing him as one of the most remarkable young men of the time, both in position and in ability. In Paris, Albert was considered a model of perfection, and Franz spoke no more than the truth. He explained how Albert regretted missing the chance to be presented to the Countess during her stay in Paris, and how he now wished to make amends. Franz, taking it upon himself, asked forgiveness for the boldness of arranging the introduction. The Countess received Albert with grace, bowing kindly, and then welcomed Franz with a warm gesture. She invited Albert to sit beside her while pointing out a seat behind her chair for Franz, suggesting he might enjoy the ballet from there. Albert quickly immersed himself in conversation about Paris, eagerly discussing familiar names and places. Franz, noticing how comfortable Albert felt, chose not to interrupt. Instead, he took up Albert's glass and began to scan the audience. Across from him, seated in the front row of a box high on the third tier, Franz noticed a strikingly beautiful woman in traditional Greek attire, which seemed perfectly natural upon her. Behind her, cloaked in shadow, sat a man whose features could not be distinguished. Franz asked the Countess if she knew anything about the elegant Albanian woman opposite them. The Countess explained that she had seen her often in the same place since the beginning of the season. Sometimes she was joined by the same shadowed figure. and at other times she was attended only by a black servant. To the Countess, the young woman's beauty resembled that of Medora from the old tales. With that, she returned to her conversation with Albert, while Franz's eyes lingered on the mysterious figure. The ballet began, staged with remarkable precision under the direction of Henri, a master of choreography. The entire company, numbering more than 100 performers, moved as though guided by one single mind. It was called Poliska. The audience watched in delight, but Franz scarcely noticed the stage. His attention remained fixed on the Greek woman, whose childlike enthusiasm for the performance stood in contrast to her companion's indifference. The man sat motionless, unmoved even by the loudest crashes of trumpets and cymbals, as though lost in another world. When the curtain fell, the audience erupted in applause. Soon after, the second act of the opera began, and Franz saw the man rise slowly to speak briefly with the Greek woman before resuming his shadowed place. Still, Franz could not make out his features. His attention turned to the stage as the opera's celebrated duet unfolded, a piece of heartbreaking beauty by Donizetti. Though Franz had heard it before, the music still shook him with its raw emotion. He rose with the audience, ready to applaud, but his hands dropped in sudden shock. The man in the opposite box stepped forward into the light. Franz instantly recognized him. It was the same mysterious figure from Monte Cristo's grotto, the very man he had encountered the night before in the Colosseum. All uncertainty vanished. His strange host now stood before him in Rome. The realization sent a jolt through him, so visible that the Countess, puzzled by his expression, laughed and asked what had startled him. Franz brushed aside her teasing and pressed her to tell him about the man with the Greek woman. She confessed she knew nothing more than he did. With her opera glass raised, she studied him and remarked that he looked as though he had stepped out of a grave, pale and haunting like something not quite human. Franz admitted he had seen him before and suspected the man recognized him as well. The Countess shivered, remarking that anyone who had once seen such a man could never forget him. She compared him to Lord Ruthven, Byron's fictional vampire, a remark that drew a brief smile from Franz despite the chill of recognition. To her, the man's ghostly appearance, black hair, fiery eyes, and the mystery surrounding the foreign woman at his side were proof of something unnatural. She begged Franz not to approach him that night. Byron himself had spoken of vampires, she said, and the description fit too perfectly. With fear and fascination mingling in her voice, she insisted Franz remain by her side, promising that if he still wished to investigate further, he could do so another day. Tonight, however, she declared she would not let him go. Franz insisted that he could not postpone his pursuit until the following day, as many reasons compelled him to continue that night. Yet the Countess urged him not to be so headstrong. She confessed that she was returning home early, since she had a party at her house that evening, and could not remain until the end of the opera. She could not imagine that Franz would be so ungallant as to refuse her escort when she asked him for it. Franz had no choice but to comply. He picked up his hat, opened the door of the box, and offered his arm to the Countess. Her agitation was clear, and Franz himself felt a superstitious dread. Her fears seemed born of instinct and of the dark tale she had heard, while his unease drew strength from remembered associations that deepened his anxiety. He could feel her arm tremble as he helped her into the carriage. Once they reached her hotel, he realized she had not been truthful about expecting guests. Her unexpected return surprised the servants, proving she longed only for solitude to calm her troubled mind. The Countess admitted that she had used a little subterfuge. She explained that the disturbing presence of the stranger had left her deeply unsettled, and she wished to be alone to regain her composure. Franz tried to smile at her words, but she noticed his expression did not match his heart. She asked him to promise her something. He agreed, though he could not abandon his determination to discover who the mysterious man was, where he came from, and where he was going. The Countess declared that she did not know his origin, but she was certain of his destination, down below, without doubt. She pressed him again for a promise. She wanted his word that he would return to his hotel immediately and make no attempt to follow the man that night. She pleaded that there were strange connections between people they encountered, and she feared that Franz might serve as a link between her and the stranger. She begged him to pursue his investigation the next day if he wished, but never to bring the man near her again, for terror would overwhelm her. With that, she said good night and left Franz to wonder whether her fears were genuine or only an amusement at his expense. When Franz returned to the hotel, he found Albert lounging on a sofa in his dressing gown and slippers, smoking a cigar. Albert was surprised to see him back so soon. Franz used the moment to correct what he believed was Albert's mistaken notion about Italian women. He pointed out that Albert's repeated failures in his own love affairs should have taught him better. Albert, however, declared that these women were impossible to understand. They offered their hands, returned pressure warmly, spoke in whispers, and allowed men to accompany them home. In Paris, such behavior would have ruined a woman's reputation. Franz explained that Italian women lived more in public, had little to conceal, and that the Countess's alarm had been sincere. Albert, unconvinced, said the stranger looked like nothing more than a distinguished gentleman, well-dressed, pale but refined. Franz quietly reflected that Albert's own pride in his pale complexion made the remark somewhat ironic. Still, the discussion strengthened Franz's conviction that the Countess's terror lacked reason. When Albert mentioned hearing the stranger speak in the Romaic dialect, Franz was startled. That detail confirmed his own suspicions, though he chose not to reveal them. Albert then changed the subject, explaining that he had been planning a surprise. Since no carriages or horses could be found, he proposed a new idea. Why not hire a cart with a pair of oxen? If they decorated the cart and dressed themselves as Neapolitan reapers, they could create a striking scene, especially if the Countess joined them as a peasant girl, beautiful enough to resemble a Madonna. Franz admitted the plan was ingenious, and Albert felt proud of its originality. Their conversation was interrupted when their landlord, Signor Pastrini, appeared with news. Rather than a cart and oxen, he explained that the Count of Monte Cristo himself had heard of their difficulties and offered them seats in his carriage, as well as places at his windows in the Palazzo Rospoli. The two young men were astonished. Albert hesitated at accepting such generosity from a stranger, while Franz questioned whether the Count of Monte Cristo was as noble as their landlord claimed. At that moment, a servant entered with 2 cards from the Count, inviting them to name a time when he might wait upon them as their neighbor. The gesture was elegant, and Albert declared it showed refinement and knowledge of the world. Franz agreed, and they accepted the invitation. Albert admitted some regret at abandoning his imaginative tableau with the oxen, but the offer of the Palazzo Rospoli windows more than compensated for the loss. Franz concurred, deciding with him that the invitation of the Count was the better choice. The mention of seats at the Palazzo Rospoli instantly reminded Franz of the conversation he had overheard the previous evening in the ruins of the Colosseum. He recalled the words exchanged between the mysterious cloaked stranger and the Transteverin, where the unknown man promised to secure the freedom of a condemned criminal. If this cloaked individual truly proved to be the same person Franz had seen at the Teatro Argentina, then Franz would be able to confirm his identity and continue his investigation with greater ease and freedom. That night Franz was restless, plagued by uneasy dreams about his 2 encounters with this troubling figure. Whenever he awoke, his mind filled with speculation about what the next day might bring. He told himself that unless the Count of Monte Cristo possessed the mythical ring of Gyges, allowing him to vanish at will, there was no way he could escape discovery this time. By 8 o'clock, Franz was already awake, dressed, and ready, while Albert still slept soundly, having no reason to rise early. Franz summoned Signor Pastrini, who entered with his usual polite eagerness. Franz inquired whether an execution was scheduled for that day. The landlord confirmed it, and though he assumed Franz was too late to secure a window to view the spectacle, Franz explained that he had no such intention. Even had he wished to watch, he could have gone to Monte Pincio. Pastrini was surprised at this, since that hill was usually crowded with common people who claimed it as their own place of gathering. Franz asked instead for details of the executions, the number of condemned men, their names, and the manner of their deaths. The landlord said he was fortunate, for he had just received the tavelettas, the wooden boards posted on street corners before executions. These notices listed the names of the condemned, their crimes, and their punishments, so that faithful Catholics might pray for their souls. Pastrini admitted he had no time for prayers himself, but he made an arrangement with the man who posted the papers, so that he might provide this information to curious guests, much like he would with theater playbills. Franz thanked him and asked to see one. The landlord produced a tablet from the wall near the chamber. Franz read it carefully. It announced that on Wednesday, February 23rd, the first day of the carnival, executions would be carried out in the Piazza del Popolo. 2 men were condemned: Andrea Rondello, guilty of murdering a priest, Don Cesar Torlini, and Peppino, known as Rocca Priori, convicted as an accomplice of the infamous bandit Luigi Vampa. Andrea would suffer the punishment of macellato, while Peppino would be beheaded. The notice urged Christians to pray for their repentance. Everything Franz read matched exactly the details he had overheard in the Colosseum, proving beyond doubt that the Transteverin was likely Luigi Vampa himself, and the cloaked man was the same figure once known to him as Sinbad the Sailor, who seemed to continue his strange, philanthropic missions in Rome. As time moved on, Franz decided to wake Albert. Before he could do so, Albert entered already dressed, eager for the excitement of carnival. Franz then asked the landlord whether they might visit the Count of Monte Cristo at once to thank him for his courtesy. Pastrini assured him it would not be an intrusion, for the Count was always an early riser and had surely been awake for hours. Albert agreed that they should go immediately. The landlord led them across the landing, which separated their rooms from the Count's apartments, rang the bell, and when the servant opened the door, he announced respectfully, "The French gentleman." The servant bowed with respect and invited the 2 young men to enter. They walked through 2 richly decorated rooms, far beyond what they ever expected to find under the roof of Signor Pastrini. At last, they were shown into an elegant drawing room. The floor was covered with luxurious Turkey carpets, while soft couches, inviting armchairs, and deep sofas seemed ready to offer comfort to anyone who sought rest. On the walls hung splendid paintings by great masters, interspersed with magnificent trophies of war. Heavy curtains of costly tapestry draped the doorways, giving the entire room an air of grandeur. The servant asked them politely to take their seats, promising to inform the Count of their arrival. With that, he disappeared behind one of the rich curtains. For a brief moment, the sound of a guzla floated into the room, but the rapid closing of the door allowed only a single swell of harmony to linger in the air. Franz and Albert exchanged glances, then looked once more at the lavish furnishings. The longer they observed the apartment, the more splendid and astonishing it appeared. Franz asked his friend what he thought of it all. Albert replied that their attentive and refined neighbor must surely be either a successful speculator who had profited from financial ventures or some disguised prince traveling in secret. Franz cautioned him to remain quiet, for the truth would soon be revealed. As Franz spoke, a door creaked open. The heavy tapestry was drawn aside, and the master of the house appeared. Albert immediately rose to greet him, but Franz sat motionless, struck with a sense of recognition. Before him stood not only the mysterious stranger of the Colosseum and the man he had seen at the Teatro Argentina, but also the extraordinary host of Monte Cristo himself. The Count of Monte Cristo entered the room, expressing regret that his visit had preceded theirs, explaining that he had feared disturbing them earlier in their own apartments. Since they had already sent word of their intention to come to him, he had simply remained available at their disposal. Albert responded with gratitude, acknowledging that both he and Franz owed the Count thanks for rescuing them from a difficult situation. They had been on the verge of resorting to a most impractical arrangement when his timely invitation reached them. The Count, motioning them to sit, added that the delay had been caused by Pastrini, who had failed to mention their difficulty. Living in isolation, he eagerly welcomed every chance of forming new acquaintances, and once aware of their predicament, he had been quick to extend his services. Both young men bowed in acknowledgement, though Franz himself remained silent. He had not yet decided how to approach the Count, for the man's demeanor showed no sign of expecting recognition. Unsure whether to bring up past encounters or to wait for more certainty, Franz restrained himself. While convinced that this was the same figure he had seen in the theater box the previous evening, he was less certain about the mysterious presence at the Colosseum. He therefore resolved to let events unfold naturally, holding the advantage of possessing knowledge of the Count's secret without having anything himself to conceal. Quietly, however, he aimed to guide the conversation toward matters that might confirm or dismiss his suspicions. At length, Franz inquired about the Count's offer of seats in his carriage and at the Rospoli Palace, asking whether it would be possible to view the Piazza del Popolo. The Count, with apparent nonchalance but a keen look directed at Morcerf, mentioned the likelihood of an execution taking place there. Franz confirmed this, and the Count remarked that he had instructed his steward the previous day to make arrangements, offering to provide this additional courtesy. He extended his hand and rang a bell 3 times, then explained to Franz that he had long studied ways to save time by assigning meaning to the number of rings. Once for his valet, twice for his major domo, and thrice for his steward. In this manner, no time or words were wasted, and indeed, the steward appeared at once. A man of about 50 entered the room, closely resembling the smuggler who had once guided Franz into the cavern, though he showed no sign of recognition. It was clear that he was simply following instructions. The Count addressed him as Bertuccio and confirmed that the steward had secured windows overlooking the Piazza del Popolo. Though the task had been completed late, the Count brushed aside the details, refusing to trouble his guests with such arrangements. Instead, he ordered Bertuccio to instruct the coachman and remain ready to escort them when the time came. Before dismissing him, the Count also requested news of the scheduled execution, but Franz intervened, explaining that he had already copied the official announcement. With that, Bertuccio was dismissed, and the Count invited his 2 guests to remain for breakfast, assuring them it would be a pleasure rather than a burden. He then read aloud from Franz's notes, which announced the execution of Andrea Rondello, condemned for the murder of a respected clergyman, and of Peppino, convicted of assisting the infamous bandit Luigi Vampa. The Count explained that Rondello would suffer the brutal punishment of the mazzolata, while Peppino was to be decapitated. Yet he added that whispers of a possible pardon for Peppino had circulated the previous evening, which would deprive them of witnessing a guillotine execution. With cold detachment, he remarked on the efficiency of the French blade compared to the clumsy cruelty of older methods, and he dismissed European punishments as relics of a crude and outdated barbarity. Franz observed that the Count seemed deeply familiar with such practices and asked whether he had deliberately studied them. The Count admitted that he had witnessed many, confessing that horror had given way to indifference and then to curiosity. Death, he argued, was life's greatest preoccupation, and it was only natural to study the many ways by which body and soul might part. He insisted that frequent exposure to death diminished fear of it, though he maintained that execution was no true expiation. When Franz pressed him, The Count revealed his darker reasoning. No simple stroke of the guillotine could balance the agony of losing a loved one to cruelty and violence. Society, in his view, offered only an illusion of justice, granting brief physical pain in exchange for years of unbearable suffering. The conversation turned to dueling, which Albert defended as an honorable means of redress. The Count dismissed the notion with scorn, pointing out that a duel was often nothing more than a performance that allowed the guilty to escape under the guise of honor. True vengeance, he declared, would mirror the slow and devastating torment inflicted by the original crime. He admitted, however, that he would gladly duel over minor insults, confident in his mastery of arms and his indifference to danger. But for deeper wrongs, he believed in measured, enduring retribution, an eye for an eye, as he put it, echoing the Orient. Franz objected that such a philosophy risked blinding judgment and inviting ruin, but the Count countered that wealth, skill, and resolve could shield a man even from the law. Finally, with a sudden shift, he dismissed the grim topic as unfit for carnival, reminding his guests that breakfast awaited and leading them toward the table. The servant entered the room announcing readiness, and the two young men rose to join the breakfast table. The meal was well prepared and elegantly served. Franz, however, kept observing Albert, expecting to see some reaction to the Count of Monte Cristo's earlier words. To his surprise, Albert seemed unaffected, eating heartily like someone weary of months of poor Italian cooking. The Count himself barely touched the dishes, behaving more like a polite host than a participant, which reminded Franz of a strange fear the Countess G. once expressed about him, even suspecting he was a vampire. When breakfast ended, Franz checked his watch, and the matter of attending the execution at the Piazza del Popolo arose. Franz politely declined the offer of costumes and a private room near the scaffold, preferring instead only to watch from the Count's carriage and window. The Count warned him he would miss an extraordinary spectacle, but Franz insisted he would be just as impressed by the Count's description. Albert, on the other hand, eventually gave in to the Count's persuasive words, agreeing to witness the event, comparing it to cultural traditions like bullfights in Spain and spectacles of ancient Rome. Before leaving, Franz asked if they could pass through the Corso, to which the Count agreed, arranging for their carriage to meet them later. Just then, a servant announced a penitent at the door, and the Count excused himself, asking his guests to return to the salon where they found fine cigars waiting. Albert, delighted with the genuine puros, praised the Count as a remarkable host, a man of knowledge, experience, and refinement, especially appreciating his cigars. Franz then mentioned how attentively the Count had been observing Albert. Somewhat puzzled, Albert brushed it off, reasoning that after his long absence from Paris his clothes were outdated, and perhaps the Count mistook him for a provincial. He asked Franz to correct that impression at the earliest opportunity. Franz smiled just as the Count entered, who declared himself ready to join them and suggested they take a different route toward the Piazza del Popolo, passing along the Corso. He urged them to accept more cigars, to which Albert agreed, adding that Parisian ones were far superior, and promising to repay the favor when the Count visited France. Without wasting time, the three men set off together, the coachman following his master's orders as they made their way down the Via del Babuino. As they passed along the Piazza di Spagna and the Via Fratina between the Fiano and Rospoli palaces, Franz's gaze was drawn to the windows of the Rospoli residence, remembering the signal arranged between the cloaked stranger and the peasant from Trastevere. The Count identified his rooms with casual indifference, and Franz quickly noticed the marked windows, two with yellow damask and one with white and a red cross, confirming that the man in the cloak had kept his promise. Around them, the city prepared for the festival, with scaffolds, flags, and spectators filling every vantage point. Descending the Corso, The three men approached the Piazza del Popolo, where the swelling crowd revealed two stark sights above the masses. The obelisk crowned with a cross, and, near its base, the execution scaffold with its curved blade glinting ominously. The Count's steward awaited them at the corner, leading them to an upstairs room of a nearby palace, hired at a high price. Inside, elegant masquerade costumes of blue and white satin had been arranged for Franz and Albert, chosen by the Count himself to suit the season and resist the confetti thrown at Carnival. Yet Franz scarcely noticed, his attention fixed on the grim structure dominating the square. It was his first encounter with a guillotine, though here in Rome the mandaia, built nearly on the same model, differed only in the crescent-shaped blade and its shorter drop. On the scaffold, two assistants lounged on the wooden plank, eating bread and sausages as they waited for the condemned. One pulled out a flask of wine, drank, and passed it to the other, a chillingly casual gesture before death. The sight made sweat bead on Franz's forehead. Meanwhile, the prisoners had been brought the night before to Santa Maria del Popolo, where they spent the night confined under guard and spiritual watch. A double line of carbineers stretched from the chapel door to the scaffold, enclosing a wide path and clearing space around the guillotine itself. Beyond that, the square was a sea of heads, mothers lifting children to see better. The Monte Pincio transformed into a vast amphitheater, every balcony and stairway crammed with spectators. The Count's words echoed true. The greatest spectacle of life was death. Yet instead of silence, the crowd buzzed with laughter and jest, treating the execution as the opening of Carnival. Then, suddenly, the noise died away. The doors of the church opened, and a procession of gray-clad penitents emerged, hooded figures carrying lighted tapers, their leader solemnly at the head. Behind the penitents came a man of massive size and powerful build. His body was bare except for a pair of cloth drawers, from which hung a large knife in its sheath. On his right shoulder, he carried a heavy, iron sledgehammer. This figure was the executioner. Sandals bound with cords were strapped to his feet, and he walked with an imposing air. Following him came two condemned men, Peppino first and Andrea after him, each escorted by priests. Their eyes were uncovered. Peppino stepped forward with firm resolve, already knowing the fate that awaited him. Andrea, however, leaned heavily on the priest for support. Both men occasionally pressed their lips against the crucifix held before them. The sight was so grim that Franz felt his legs weaken. He turned toward Albert, who had turned pale and instinctively tossed away his half-smoked cigar. The Count alone appeared composed. A strange glow touched his pale cheeks, and his nostrils widened like those of a predator catching the scent of prey. His lips parted to reveal small, sharp teeth, yet his expression softened with an almost tender smile. His black eyes, unusually, held kindness and pity. As the prisoners drew closer, their features became distinct. Peppino was a striking young man of about 25, bronzed by the sun, his head lifted high as though waiting for a sign of rescue. Andrea, in contrast, was short, stout, and carried a face marked by cruelty. Though only 30, his beard and rough appearance made him look older. His head sagged to one side, his legs bent under him, and his movements seemed mechanical, as if life itself had drained away. Franz was unsettled. He recalled expecting only one execution, and confusion overtook him. He observed as Peppino reached the base of the scaffold. At that very moment, a priest arrived breathless, forcing his way through the soldiers. He handed a folded paper to the chief of the Brotherhood. Peppino's sharp eyes caught the exchange. The paper was opened, and with raised voice the friar proclaimed that heaven had granted mercy, and a pardon had come for one of the prisoners. The crowd erupted in a single cry, "A pardon!" Andrea lifted his head suddenly, desperate to know for whom. The announcement followed. The pardon was for Peppino, known as Rocca Priori. The paper was read aloud, confirming the news. Andrea, shaken from his stupor, burst out in rage. He demanded to know why mercy was given to his companion and not to him. He shouted that they had been meant to die together and that he would not accept death alone. His voice grew wild as he fought against the cords binding him. Like a beast in a trap, he raged, trying to break free. The executioner signaled his assistants, who leapt from the scaffold and seized him with force. The struggle on the ground was violent. Andrea shouted that he would not die alone, insisting his companion must perish with him. The Count, watching, turned to his companions with fierce intensity. He explained that this man had drawn strength from knowing another shared his punishment. He compared it to beasts. Two animals led to slaughter would rejoice if one were spared. Yet man, created in the image of God and commanded to love his neighbor, responded with anger and curses at the salvation of another. With bitter irony, the Count laughed aloud, his voice carrying the sound of one who had suffered greatly. The scene grew more terrible. Andrea's struggle continued as he cried out in desperation, while the crowd turned against him. From every side came the call, "Put him to death." The assistants dragged him toward the scaffold. Franz recoiled, but the Count seized his arm, forcing him to witness. The Count argued that pity was wasted. A mad dog would be put down without hesitation. Yet here was a man guilty of betraying and murdering his benefactor, now furious that another should live. The Count urged them to watch. Franz, horrified, could not look away. Andrea fought savagely as the assistants forced him to his knees. The executioner stood poised, raising his mace. In one swift blow, the weapon struck Andrea's temple. A dull, heavy sound followed, and the man collapsed lifeless to the ground. The executioner dropped the mace, drew his knife, and cut his throat in a single stroke. Climbing onto the body, he pressed his feet down violently, forcing blood to spurt with each strike. The spectacle was unbearable. Franz sank into a seat, faint and shaken. Albert stood motionless, his eyes closed, clinging to the curtains for support. The Count alone stood tall, radiant with a fierce, triumphant presence, like an avenging angel.